Oh look, I've got some comments on my video.
You are a bad teacher.
Ouch. What about this one?
Your cunning lies are ripped apart here.
Okay, and there's a link to the response video. And here's another one.
Same old excuses. This doesn't even scratch the surface. Your logic is extremely flawed. You have not done a single experiment.
Let's see, let me skip down. We follow evidence, Mickelson Morley, Aries failure, government documents, lasers, Rob Simmons, Blue Marble, Photoshop. Anyway, it continues.
You, sir, are intellectually dishonest. Shame on you. But thanks for covering this topic. As poor of a job as you did, this will no doubt increase our numbers and more people will realize how foolish the heliocentric model is. Much love.
Oh, wow. Thanks, I think. So, I got a lot of responses to my video about flat Earth evidence, as I expected I might. I'll respond to a couple of the ideas here. Let's start with that criticism that I have not done a single experiment. He's right, I haven't. However, personal experience, observation, and experiments are not the only source of truth. It's okay to take things on authority if you trust the source to be reliable. For example, I believe that the Eiffel Tower exists, but I've never seen it with my own eyes. I've seen photographs, I've heard friends and family talk about seeing it, and I trust that they are telling the truth and are reliable sources of knowledge. Therefore, I believe the Eiffel Tower exists. Similarly, I believe the evidence of eyewitness testimony from astronauts and photographs from space. Now, a flat earther might say, no, that's different because you can't go to space and you could go to Paris and personally verify that the Eiffel Tower exists. That's true, but in the meantime, before I go to Paris, at this moment in time, I think it's still rationally justifiable for me to believe that the Eiffel Tower exists, independent of my ability to personally verify it by direct observation. Therefore, I reject the notion that doing experiments or direct observations are the only sources of truth. Next, I'm going to read the entire comment from Dr. John D., since his comment is a great example of the kinds of tactics often employed by flat earthers. Here's what he says. Dear Matthew Weathers, please supply empirical evidence for the radius of the Earth, since you state that it is most rational to believe that the Earth is a globe. Rational and belief in the same sentence? That speaks for itself. By empirical, I mean observable and repeatable and not based on any begging the question or affirming the consequent fallacies. Also, no appeals to authority or consensus. CGI images from a second law of thermodynamics violation are not empirical evidence. Your evidence must be observable and repeatable by a person, such as myself. I look forward to receiving your empirical evidence and repeating the observation for myself to validate yours. If you can't supply the requested empirical evidence, perhaps you will do a video stating such. I sincerely hope you will approach this request with intellectual integrity and honesty and will not attempt to obfuscate and deflect. After a week from this date, I will assume that you cannot provide empirical evidence for the radius of the Earth, but still wish to believe that it is rational to think the Earth is a globe. Kind regards, John D. First of all, respect to John D. for earning a PhD. That's a long and tedious process and requires a lot of work, so good job. He says, please supply empirical evidence for the radius of the Earth, and then proceeds to set out a bunch of limitations on what he would count as empirical evidence. It would have to be observable and repeatable, and probably couldn't assume that the Earth is a globe, otherwise he would call it a begging the question fallacy or an affirming the consequent fallacy. But that doesn't make sense. If you're going to measure the radius, you would first have to assume that there is a radius. Maybe he meant to ask for empirical evidence that the Earth is a globe? I don't know. Those are two separate questions. One, is the Earth a globe? And then two, if it is, what's the radius? I think you might be conflating those two. Anyway, finding the radius has a long history. Historians think the ancient Greek Eratosthenes may have done a measurement in which he assumed the Earth was a globe and used that to determine the radius. We think he probably came within 10% of the right answer. We don't know exactly because we don't have an exact conversion from ancient stades into modern kilometers. But still, getting that close 2,300 years ago is quite an achievement. So, when I cite Eratosthenes as an example of measuring the radius of the Earth, it's not a proof of a globe, but instead an example of how the radius of Earth can be measured, assuming that the Earth is a globe. Next, John says, if you can't supply the requested empirical evidence, perhaps you will do a video stating such. Yes, I admit that I cannot supply empirical evidence, especially using your definition of empirical evidence. And in this video, I hereby state that I cannot. However, I deny that empirical evidence is the only source of knowledge and truth. Like the example of the Eiffel Tower I mentioned earlier. As I mentioned in my original video, I like the example of the radio wave deniers. I cannot prove any direct evidence for for the existence of radio waves coming from my cell phone because we human beings cannot sense electromagnetic radiation in that range. I cannot see it, I can't hear it, and I can't sense it or feel it in any other way. I would have to rely on indirect means by using electromagnetic sensors or radio equipment. However, this does not diminish my belief that radio waves actually exist. Likewise, although I cannot directly measure the radius of the Earth in a way that would satisfy your overly restrictive conditions, that does not mean that we can't use other sources of knowledge to determine facts about the Earth. He ends his comment with an ultimatum, assuming that I wouldn't answer his comment. After a week from this date, I will assume that you cannot provide empirical evidence, and so on. In other words, if I don't meet his requirements, he's off to declare another victory over a glober. That's fine. I suspect he'd probably declare victory no matter what. And ironically, I actually agree with that last sentence, that I will still wish to believe that it is rational to think the Earth is a globe. Yes, I still continue to believe that it is rational. This goes back to the definition of believe. Earlier in his comment, he says rational and believe in the same sentence. That speaks for itself. But philosophers who think carefully about the meaning of these words would have no problem with the way that I stated it. As far as I can tell, he uses the word believe to mean something like thinking that something is true without any solid evidence. And maybe even implied in the definition is that there is no solid evidence, otherwise you would know the thing, not just believe it. Again, as I mentioned in the original video, that's just a bizarre definition. Yes, it is true that one definition of believe is to think something is true without having proof or empirical evidence. But that's just one meaning. Another meaning is just to accept something as true. Words can have multiple meanings. Philosophers use the word believe in very precise ways, and they would say it's possible to believe true things, and also that if you know something, you can also believe it. In fact, I think they would say that knowledge implies belief. In other words, believe and know are not mutually exclusive, and I think some flat earthers treat them as non-overlapping terms. You either believe or you know, but never both. So yes, I say it's rational to believe the Earth is a globe. Finally, I wanted to talk a bit more about whether light can bend in that black swan image. In this video, we see a laser bending in a specially designed piece of plastic. In order for me to claim that the black swan image is actually possible on a globe, all I have to do is say that light bends at least 0.01 degrees per mile. In other words, if light can sometimes bend in the humid air right above the ocean, at least 1/10,000th as much as we see happening here, that's enough for a globe to appear flat since the light is bending around it. To put it another way, in order for the black swan to be an effective proof against the globe, flat earthers would need to show that light is not bending even that tiny amount. They would need to somehow show that this cannot be the explanation. If it can bend, even just that little bit, then all bets are off and the black swan is inconclusive either way. Again, here's that time-lapse looking over water. Squinting through telescopes at tiny differences near the horizon isn't going to tell you anything useful when humid air distorts things this much. Therefore, all you have to do to discount their beloved black swan proof is to realize that light can bend a tiny bit sometimes. By the way, even ancient sailors knew this and avoided using the position of stars lower than 20 degrees above the horizon for navigation. When you get too close to the water, things become too distorted, and their whole black swan argument depends on those distortions. Therefore, it fails and does not prove the Earth is flat. Anyway, I'm tired of talking about all this, so I imagine you're tired of listening. So I'll end the video here, but I do want to say thanks for watching all the way to the end. I appreciate it. Take it easy. Until next time, goodbye.